Listen close now, children of dust and memory. Come gather around this dying fire where shadows dance like the spirits of our people. What I'm fixin' to tell you ain't just some tale to pass the time. It's a piece of soul torn from the red clay of the deep south. It's the remembrance of a woman they tried to break. But Lord have mercy, she was made of iron wrapped in flesh. In them days of deep sorrow, when the cotton fields stretched like white graves under a burning sun, there lived a woman whose name the masters tried to bury. But the old folks, they kept whispering it in the quarters at night. Charlotte, they called her. Charlotte of the Salt Whip. Her story runs through our blood like river water, bitter and true. Now you see people, in them plantation days, we wasn't born with dates written in no book. We was born to the sound of iron on wood, to the smell of old sweat and dried blood. Charlotte came into this world marked not by her daddy's name, but by the crack of leather and the taste of fear. That land ate people alive, and she learned early that surviving was a quiet war fought with every breath. Charlotte grew up knowing the sound of suffering before she knew her own voice. Lord have mercy. That child had the wide shoulders of one who'd been carrying sacks since she could walk, and eyes deep as a well where hope had long drowned. But don't mistake her quiet for weakness. Inside that tired body lived a fire passed down from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, since the Middle Passage when our tongues was ripped out, but our fury learned to sleep awake. The plantation where she drew her first breath was hell's own garden, tended by devils in white linen. Master Whitmore, they called the man who owned her flesh, a man with pale eyes like winter frost and hands that never knew honest work. His overseer, Burns, was meaner than a snake with its tail caught and twice as dangerous. That one had scars on his knuckles from beaten folks, and he wore 'em like jewelry. The slave quarters sat in a long row, cabins built from rough wood and clay, cramped together like coffins standing upright. Each one held whole families squeezed into spaces not fit for animals. The walls was thin as paper, so every cry, every prayer, every last breath echoed through all our lives. We learned early to muffle our grief, 'cause even sorrow had to be quiet in them days. In the center of the plantation yard stood the whipping post, not hidden away where decent folk couldn't see. No, sir, that thing was planted right where everyone had to walk past it every day. Old oak it was, worn smooth from hands tied to it, stained dark with blood that the rain never could wash clean. The whip hung there always, not as a tool but as a promise, a reminder that our bodies wasn't ours to claim. Charlotte was maybe 7 summers old when she first saw a whipping. Old Samuel had been caught with a piece of cornbread in his pocket, saving it for his sick wife instead of eating it right there in the field. They stripped his shirt and tied his hands high. The overseer took his time, letting that leather whistle through the air before it found flesh. Each crack sounded like thunder, and Samuel's back opened up like red flowers blooming in spring. But what marked Charlotte's soul wasn't just the whipping itself. It was what came after. Master Whitmore walked up calm as Sunday morning, carrying a bowl of coarse salt. "Salt heals," he said with a smile cold as January. Then he rubbed it into them fresh wounds while Samuel screamed to wake the dead. Not screams of pain, screams of a soul being broken piece by piece. That night in the quarters, Charlotte lay on her corn-shuck mattress, listening to Samuel's wife cry soft over her husband's torn back. The old ones whispered prayers in languages the masters thought was dead, but we kept alive in our hearts. Charlotte didn't sleep. She just stared at the roof boards, learning the lesson every slave child had to learn. Pain was coming for all of us, sure as sunrise. From that day forward, she watched that whipping post like it was a snake ready to strike. She saw how folks walked wide around it, how they kept their eyes down when they passed. She saw how it changed people, made them smaller, made them forget they was human. But something in Charlotte refused to shrink. Something in her soul stood tall even when her body had to bow. Years passed like seasons of suffering, and Charlotte grew from a wide-eyed child into a woman with hands hard as stone, and a back that knew the weight of the world. She worked the cotton fields from can see to can't see, her fingers bleeding from picking bowls under that merciless sun. The cotton plants stretched endless as an ocean, white as the souls of the dead, and just as silent. In them days, Charlotte learned the plantation's rhythm like a funeral song. Dawn came with the overseer's bell, harsh and grating as a death rattle. The field hands stumbled from their quarters, still heavy with dreams of freedom that daylight always killed. They grabbed their sacks and headed to the fields, moving like ghosts of themselves. Master Whitmore's plantation was what folks called a well-organized hell. Everything had its place, from the big house sitting white and proud on the hill to the quarters squatting low and ashamed in the hollow. The house servants moved quiet as shadows through marble halls, serving fine china and pretending they couldn't hear the screams from the yard. The field hands bent their backs to earth that drank their sweat and gave nothing back but pain. Charlotte worked in the cotton mainly, but sometimes they sent her to the rice fields down by the swamp. That's where the water ran brown as blood, and the cypress trees hung with moss like funeral shrouds. The rice had to be planted in mud that sucked at your legs, and the mosquitoes swarmed thick as locusts, carrying fever and death in their tiny wings. Many a soul went down to them rice fields and never came back up. The overseer Burns rode through the fields on a horse black as his heart, carrying a bullwhip that he used free as breathing. He had favorites among the drivers, slaves who'd sold their souls for a little power over their own people. These men walked with whips of their own, cracking them over the heads of folks who moved too slow or stopped to wipe their brow. Charlotte learned to be invisible. She picked her cotton quiet and fast, keeping her eyes on the plants and her thoughts locked tight in her chest. She watched other girls her age get called to the big house to help with chores and come back broken, their eyes empty as dried wells. She saw strong men whipped till they couldn't stand, then left to crawl back to the quarters like wounded animals. But most of all, Charlotte learned about Salt. Master Whitmore had a peculiar cruelty about him. He truly believed that salt in open wounds was medicine, not 'cause he wanted to heal, but 'cause he wanted the pain to last longer, to burn deeper, to scar the soul as much as the flesh. He kept a wooden bowl of coarse salt right there by the whipping post, and every soul on that plantation knew what it was for. They say the salt came from the coast, from them same waters where the slave ships had dumped our ancestors overboard. Some of the old folks swore they could taste the tears in it, the grief of mothers who watched their babies drown, the sorrow of men who chose the ocean over chains. Whether that was true or not, that salt carried pain, and Master Whitmore used it like it was holy water in the devil's church. Charlotte had nightmares about that salt. She'd dream of being tied to the post, of the whip opening her back, of them white crystals burning into her flesh like fire from hell itself. She'd wake up sweating, her hands clutched tight to her back, checking to make sure her skin was still whole. But somehow, even in them dark dreams, she never screamed. Even sleeping, Charlotte refused to break. The plantation ran on fear, sure enough, but it also ran on hope. Hope that tomorrow might be different, that somebody might come riding down that dusty road with papers of freedom, that the Lord might finally answer all them desperate prayers. Charlotte held on to hope like it was the last piece of bread in a starving time. She had to. Without hope, she would have been just another ghost walking among the cotton rows. Now listen here, child, 'cause this is where the story takes a turn toward the darkness. Charlotte was maybe 18 summers by then, grown into the kind of woman that masters noticed and good folk worried about. She had strength in her shoulders and fire in her eyes that no amount of whipping had been able to dim. That fire was what got her in trouble. The plantation was more than just fields and quarters. It was a whole world built on breaking people down. The big house sat like a white tomb on the hill, all columns and verandas where white folks sipped sweet tea while we sweated blood in the fields below. Inside them walls, crystal glasses caught sunlight like trapped angels, and silver spoons clinked against fine china while we ate from wooden bowls when we ate at all. Master Whitmore took pride in his well-organized operation. He had ledger books where he wrote down every soul like we was livestock, every pound of cotton picked, every lash given. His wife, Miss Margaret, floated through that house like a pale ghost, always smelling of rose water and laudanum, always looking through us like we was furniture that happened to move. The kitchen was ruled by old Aunt Celia, a woman bent double with age but sharp as a razor. She'd been cooking in that house since before Charlotte was born, and she knew every secret them white walls held. Celia could make a feast from scraps and a poison from herbs, and she was wise enough to know when to use which. The house servants whispered that she kept roots and bones hidden in the pantry, protection charms passed down from the old country. Down by the stables worked a man named Moses. Not his real name, but the one he'd earned from helping folks find their way to freedom. Moses was tall as a pine tree and quiet as a prayer, with scars on his wrists from where shackles used to be. He'd been brought from another plantation after his master died, and folks said he had connections to the Underground Railroad, though nobody dared speak such things out loud. The plantation had its own church, a little white building where Master Whitmore preached about servants obeying their masters and the meek inheriting the earth. But we had our own praise house too, hidden deep in the woods where the Spanish moss hung thick. There, old preacher John would lead us in spirituals that carried hidden messages, songs about crossing over Jordan and following the drinking gourd to freedom. Charlotte had learned to move through this world like water, bending around obstacles, finding the cracks where she could breathe. She knew which overseers could be avoided and which ones would hunt you down for sport. She knew when to keep her head down and when a little spirit might earn you better treatment. Most of all, she knew never to look a white man direct in the eyes. But knowing and doing ain't always the same thing, especially when your soul is burning with righteous anger. Charlotte had been carrying that fire since she was 7 years old, nursing it through every insult, every injustice. Every night she went to bed hungry while the big house blazed with light and laughter. That fire had kept her alive, but fire has a way of demanding to be fed. The trouble started on a day when the sun beat down merciless, and the cotton bowls hung heavy as grief. Charlotte was working her row, same as always, when Master Whitmore came riding through with some visitors. Other plantation owners come to admire his well-trained stock. They stopped their horses right beside where Charlotte was picking, talking about her like she was a prize mare at auction. "Look at the shoulders on that one," said one of the visitors. "Bet she could birth strong sons." "Indeed," Master Whitmore replied, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Charlotte's one of my finest. Strong back, good temperament, hasn't given me a day's trouble." That's when it happened. Charlotte's hand stilled on the cotton bowls and something deep inside her snapped like a dry twig. Without thinking, without remembering all them years of careful training, she lifted her head and looked Master Whitmore straight in his pale blue eyes. Not a glance, not an accident. A long, hard look that said everything her voice wasn't allowed to say. The silence that followed was thick as molasses and twice as dangerous. Master Whitmore's face went red as blood, and the visitors shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Every slave in hearing distance stopped their work, knowing that something terrible was about to unfold. Charlotte had committed the one sin that no amount of good behavior could wash clean. She had forgotten her place. "Charlotte," Master Whitmore said, his voice soft and deadly. "Come here." Charlotte's feet felt like they was rooted to the earth, but she knew there was no refusal, no escape. She dropped her cotton sack and walked toward them horses, her chin still raised, her eyes still bright with defiance. The other slaves watched with horror and a terrible kind of pride. Horror at what was coming, pride that one of their own had finally looked evil in the face and not blinked. "Did you just look me in the eye, gal?" Master Whitmore asked. "Yes, sir," Charlotte said, her voice steady as stone. "I did." And that's when hell opened up its gates and invited Charlotte inside. Now you see, people, what I'm fixin' to tell you next ain't easy to hear, but it's gotta be told. 'Cause the memories we carry ain't just our own. They belong to all the souls who came before, all the mothers and fathers and children who crossed that dark water in chains, their spirits still crying out for justice from the deep. Charlotte's defiance that day in the cotton field opened up something that had been locked tight in her chest since she was a girl. It was like breaking open a dam that had been holding back generations of rage, generations of sorrow that started long before she drew her first breath. The memories came rushing through her blood like a river in flood time, memories that wasn't even hers but belonged to her people. She remembered things she never lived through, the darkness of the ship's belly, where bodies was packed tight as cargo, chained wrist to ankle in their own filth and despair. The smell of death and sickness, the moaning of souls who knew they'd never see home again, the splash of bodies thrown overboard when disease took hold, mothers watching their babies disappear into waves that didn't care about love or loss. These wasn't Charlotte's memories, but they lived in her bones just the same. They was passed down like a birthright nobody wanted but everybody carried. Her grandmother's grandmother had survived that middle passage, had felt them chains bite into her skin, had breathed that foul air thick with human suffering. That woman's pain lived on in Charlotte's blood, whispering to her in the dark hours before dawn. Charlotte could feel them ancestors standing behind her as she faced Master Whitmore, their spirits gathering like storm clouds. She could hear their voices in the wind through the cotton bolls, speaking in languages the slave ships thought they'd silenced forever. They was telling her something she'd always known but never dared to speak, that she was more than property, more than a thing to be bought and sold and broken. The old ones used to say that some souls was born with the memory of chains still fresh on their spirits, and these was the ones who couldn't bow easy, couldn't forget their humanity even when the world tried to beat it out of them. Charlotte was one of these children of remembrance, marked by ancestral fire that no whip could extinguish. Standing there in that cotton field, facing the pale eyes of her master, Charlotte felt every soul that had ever been stolen from Africa rising up inside her. She felt the warrior queens who fought against slavers with spears and shields. She felt the conjure women who kept the old ways alive in secret, passing down root work and spirit knowledge to daughters and granddaughters. She felt the rebels who chose death over submission, who jumped from slave ships rather than live in bondage. Master Whitmore's visitors was shifting nervous in their saddles, not used to seeing a slave look so bold, so unbroken. They was whispering among themselves about uppity behavior and setting bad examples and needing to be taught a lesson. But Charlotte heard their words like they was coming from far away, 'cause she was listening to older voices, stronger voices, voices that sang of resistance and rebellion. The sun beat down merciless on that field, but Charlotte felt cold as winter inside, not from fear, from clarity. She finally understood what the old folks meant when they talked about ancestral calling, about spirits demanding justice through the living. She was standing at a crossroads, and she could feel the ghosts of her people pushing her toward a choice that would change everything. In that moment, Charlotte wasn't just a slave girl facing punishment. She was the daughter of kings and queens, the child of warriors and wise women, the inheritor of a legacy that no auction block could sell. The memory of her people's strength flowed through her veins like liquid fire, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. Lord have mercy. What happened next was like watching destiny unfold in slow motion. Master Whitmore climbed down from his horse, his face red as fresh blood, his hands shaken with rage. The other plantation owners stayed mounted, but their eyes was fixed on Charlotte like she was a snake ready to strike. The field hands had stopped their work completely now, knowing that what was about to happen would mark all their lives. "You impudent gal," Master Whitmore said, his voice low and dangerous. "You forget yourself." But Charlotte didn't forget herself. For the first time, she was remembering exactly who she was. The ancestors was whispering in her ear, telling her that this moment had been coming since the first ship left the African coast. Every chain that had ever bound their people, every whip that had ever fallen, every child sold away from their mama's arms. It all led to this field, this day, this choice. "I ain't forgot nothing, Master," Charlotte said, and her voice carried something that made grown men step back. It wasn't just defiance. It was the power of truth spoken by someone who had nothing left to lose. The silence stretched tight as a hangman's rope. Even the birds stopped singing, like nature itself was holding its breath. Charlotte stood there in her torn dress and bare feet, straight as a cypress tree, her eyes still locked on Whitmore's pale face. She looked like one of them African queens the old ones used to tell stories about, the ones who rode into battle with lightning in their hands and justice in their hearts. Burns the overseer came riding up fast, his horse kicking dust and his whip already in his hand. "Master Whitmore, sir. I'll handle this situation. This gal's been getting too big for her britches lately." But Whitmore held up a hand to stop him. "No, Burns. This one's mine to deal with." He walked closer to Charlotte, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel gleam in his eyes. "You looked me in the eye, Charlotte. That's something no slave does on my plantation and lives to brag about it." Charlotte felt the weight of every soul dependent on her in that moment. The children in the quarters who needed to see that somebody could stand up. The broken men who'd forgot they was human. The women who'd been used and abused till they couldn't remember their own names. They was all watching, all waiting, all hoping that maybe, just maybe, somebody could show that the spirit couldn't be killed no matter how hard they tried. "Then I reckon you better kill me," Charlotte said, and her words rang out across that field like church bells tolling for the dead. "'Cause I ain't gonna bow down no more." The visitors was muttering among themselves, saying things like, "Never seen such insolence and needs to be made an example of." One of them, a fat man with gold teeth, leaned over to Whitmore and said, "Better handle this quick before it spreads to the others." Whitmore nodded slow, like he was pondering something important. "You're right, of course. Can't let this kind of behavior go unpunished." He turned to Burns. "Get the others. Every soul on this plantation is gonna watch what happens to slaves who forget their place." Burns rode off blowing his horn, the signal that meant everybody had to drop what they was doing and come running. Within minutes, they was all gathering in the yard. Field hands with dirt still on their clothes, house servants in their clean aprons, children peeking out from behind their mama's skirts. Even old Aunt Celia came hobbling from the kitchen, her face grave as a funeral. Charlotte walked toward the whipping post without being told. She knew what was coming, had known since the moment she lifted her eyes to meet her masters. But she walked proud, her back straight, her head high. The other slaves watched her with a mixture of terror and awe, like she was walking to her own crucifixion, but had somehow found peace with it. The whipping post stood in the center of the yard like an altar to cruelty, its dark wood worn smooth by countless hands tied to it, stained with blood that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard the rain tried. Charlotte had walked past that post every day of her life, but she'd never touched it. Now she placed her palm against its rough surface and felt the pain of every soul who'd suffered there before her. Moses, the stable hand, caught her eye as she passed, and she saw something in his face that gave her strength. It was respect, pure and simple. Respect for a woman who'd chosen to stand up, even knowing the price. He nodded once, barely enough to see, but Charlotte felt it like a blessing. The gathered slaves formed a circle around the post, their faces showing the kind of pain that comes from watching your own people suffer and not being able to do nothing about it. But underneath that pain, Charlotte could see something else growing, a spark of the same fire that burned in her own chest. Her defiance was planting seeds, and someday, Lord willing, them seeds would grow into something the masters couldn't control. The leather straps was old and worn soft from use, darkened with the blood and sweat of countless souls who'd been bound to that cursed post. Burns tied Charlotte's hands high above her head, yanking the straps tight enough to cut off her circulation. Her feet barely touched the ground, and already the strain was pulling at her shoulders like they was gonna tear loose from their sockets. Master Whitmore stood before his gathered property, looking like a preacher about to deliver a sermon on damnation. His visitors sat their horses to one side, eager to see how a proper plantation master handled disciplinary problems. The slaves stood in their forced circle, eyes down but hearts breaking, knowing they was about to witness something that would haunt them till their dying day. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Whitmore began, his voice carrying across the yard like thunder before a storm. "This is what happens when you forget your place, when you think you're something more than what God made you to be." Charlotte here thought she could look me in the eye like an equal. Well, she's about to learn different. Burns was preparing the whip with the kind of care a craftsman takes with his tools. It was 9 feet of braided leather, thick as a man's thumb, with knots tied at intervals to make sure it bit deep when it landed. The overseer had been using that particular whip for near on 10 years, and it had tasted the blood of more souls than anybody cared to count. Charlotte hung from them straps, her back exposed to the merciless sun and the even more merciless eyes of her tormentors. But she wasn't broken yet. wasn't ready to beg or plead or cry out for mercy she knew wouldn't come. The ancestors was still with her, still whispering strength into her spirit. She could feel them gathering, all the warriors and queens and conjure women who'd never bowed to any master. 30 lashes, Whitmore announced. That should be enough to remind this gal of her station. 30 lashes was enough to kill a weaker soul, enough to break the spirit of even the strongest. But Charlotte had been preparing for this moment her whole life, even when she didn't know it. Every story the old ones told about resistance, every spiritual that spoke of crossing over to freedom, every night she'd laid awake dreaming of justice, it all led to this post, this moment, this choice between breaking and becoming something more than human. The first lash came without warning, splitting the air like lightning and landing across Charlotte's shoulders with a crack that echoed off the plantation buildings. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like being struck by fire itself. But Charlotte bit down on her tongue and swallowed her scream, refusing to give Whitmore the satisfaction of hearing her break. The second lash crossed the first, opening her flesh in a pattern that would scar for life. Blood began to seep through the torn fabric of her dress. But still, Charlotte held her silence. The gathered slaves flinched with each blow like they was feeling it themselves, their own backs remembering similar pain, their hearts breaking for this woman who was taking all their suffering onto herself. By the fifth lash, Charlotte's back was a roadmap of pain, the skin hanging in ribbons, blood running down to soak into the earth beneath the post. But something strange was happening. Instead of weakening, Charlotte seemed to be drawing strength from somewhere beyond herself. Her body might be breaking, but her spirit was growing larger, more powerful, fed by the pain and rage of generations. The 10th lash brought blood in earnest, splashing onto the ground like an offering to angry gods. Some of the house servants turned away, unable to watch no more. Even some of the hardest field hands was struggling to keep their composure. But Charlotte hung there like a warrior queen accepting her crown of thorns, her spirit unbroken, even as her flesh failed. At the 15th lash, Master Whitmore called a halt. Not out of mercy, but because he wanted to make sure Charlotte was still conscious for what came next. He walked over to the wooden bowl that sat beside the post, the bowl that every slave on the plantation knew and feared. It was filled with coarse salt, gray-white crystals that looked innocent as snow, but burned like the fires of hell when rubbed into open wounds. "Salt heals," Whitmore said, just like he always did. It was his favorite lie, the one he told himself to justify the extra cruelty. Can't have infections setting in. Charlotte felt the ancestors gathering closer now, their spirits forming a shield around her broken body. She could hear them singing, old songs in languages the slave ships thought they'd destroyed. War songs and grief songs and songs of resistance that had been passed down through generations of suffering. The pain was about to get worse than anything she'd ever imagined, but she wasn't facing it alone. Burns lifted the bowl of salt, his scarred hands steady as a surgeon's. The gathered slaves held their breath, knowing that what came next would be the true test of Charlotte's spirit. This was where souls were broken, where the will to resist was burned away by pain too terrible to endure. This was where Charlotte would either surrender or become legend. Now listen close, children of memory, 'cause what I'm about to tell you ain't for the faint of heart, but it's gotta be told, 'cause forgetting is worse than dying, and silence is the master's greatest weapon against our souls. The salt in that wooden bowl caught the afternoon sun like tiny diamonds, each crystal sharp enough to cut glass, white as the bones of all our ancestors who never made it to shore. Burns lifted that bowl with hands that had done this evil so many times they moved without thinking, like a preacher reaching for his Bible or a mother reaching for her child. But there wasn't nothing holy about what was fixing to happen. This was the devil's own sacrament, the moment when pain stopped being punishment and became something deeper, something meant to break the very essence of who you was. The overseer started slow, like he was savoring the moment. He took a handful of that coarse salt and let it run through his fingers, watching Charlotte's face for signs of fear. But Lord have mercy, that woman hung from them leather straps like she was made of iron wrapped in flesh. Her back was torn to ribbons, blood running down in rivers, but her eyes still burned with that fire that no whip could touch. When the salt first hit her wounds, the pain was beyond anything the human spirit was meant to endure. It wasn't just burning. It was like having liquid fire poured into every nerve, every fiber of torn muscle. The salt sought out each cut, each split in her flesh, and settled there like tiny demons sent straight from Hell's kitchen. But Charlotte didn't scream. Not yet. The gathered slaves couldn't help themselves no more. Soft moaning started from the circle, mothers covering their children's eyes, grown men turning away from what they was being forced to witness. Old Aunt Celia from the kitchen fell to her knees right there in the dirt, her lips moving in prayers older than memory, calling on ancestors and spirits and any power that might still care about the suffering of her people. Burns worked methodical, rubbing that salt deep into every wound, making sure it reached places where the pain would last for weeks, where infection might set in and finish what the whip started. Master Whitmore watched with eyes cold as winter morning, nodding approval like he was judging a job well done. His visitors sat their horses, some looking excited by the cruelty, others uncomfortable but too proud to look away. The pain built inside Charlotte like a storm gathering strength. Each grain of salt was a lightning bolt shooting through her nervous system. Each touch of Burns's hands was thunder rolling through her bones. But something else was building too. Something the masters couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't touch with all their whips and salt and chains. It was the power of refusal. The absolute, unbreakable decision that no matter what they did to her body, they could not have her spirit. Charlotte had made that choice back in the cotton field when she lifted her eyes, and now she was living it out in the most terrible way possible. Every grain of salt that bit into her flesh was also feeding the fire in her soul, making her stronger, even as it broke her body down. Moses, the stable hand, was watching from the edge of the circle, his own scars remembering similar pain, his heart breaking for this woman who was carrying the suffering of all of them on her torn shoulders. But he also saw something else. He saw a warrior being born, a legend taking shape in blood and salt and unbreakable will. This wasn't just punishment anymore. This was transformation. The salt kept coming, handful after handful, until Charlotte's back looked like a piece of raw meat rolled in white crystals. The pain had moved beyond feeling into some realm where the body just stopped registering sensation, where the mind had to go somewhere else to survive. But Charlotte's mind didn't flee to safety. It went deeper into the fire, deeper into the ancestral memories that connected her to every soul who had ever resisted, ever fought back, ever said no to oppression. When Burns finally stepped back, his work complete, Charlotte hung from those straps like a broken doll. But her eyes, Lord God Almighty, her eyes still blazed with something that made grown men step back in fear. The salt was doing its cruel work, sending waves of agony through her body that would last for hours, maybe days. But it was also doing something else, something the masters never intended. It was crystallizing her rage into something pure and hard as diamonds, something that would cut through any chain, any lie, any system built on the suffering of her people. Charlotte had entered that circle as a slave. She would leave it as something else entirely, something the plantation system had no name for, something that would haunt Master Whitmore's dreams until his dying day. The afternoon sun beat down merciless, but the real heat was coming from the fire in Charlotte's soul, a fire that no amount of salt could extinguish. They cut Charlotte down when the sun started sinking toward the horizon, her body falling like a sack of grain onto the hard-packed dirt of the plantation yard. But even unconscious, even broken and bleeding, there was something about her that made folks step careful around where she lay. She looked like one of them ancient warriors the old ones told stories about, the kind that kept fighting even after death took them. Burns and two of his drivers carried Charlotte to the quarters, her blood leaving a trail in the dust like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Except this story wasn't ending with any kind of salvation. They dumped her face down on the corn shuck mattress in her cabin, her torn back exposed to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. The salt crystals still clung to her wounds like snow that refused to melt, each one a tiny promise of continued agony. Old Aunt Celia came shuffling from the big house soon as the overseer left, carrying a basket filled with things that weren't supposed to exist on a Christian plantation. Roots and herbs and bottles filled with liquids that caught the light strange. She'd been a conjure woman before they brought her to the kitchen, back when she was young, and her hands still held the power to heal as well as cook. "Lord, have mercy on this child," Celia whispered as she knelt beside Charlotte's broken form. She started pulling things from her basket: moss from the north side of oak trees, water from a spring that never saw sunlight, leaves from plants that grew wild in the deep swamp where the masters never went. These was the old medicines, the ones that came from Africa in the minds and hearts of stolen people. Other women from the quarters gathered quiet as death around Charlotte's cabin. They came bringing what little they could: clean rags torn from their own worn-out dresses, cool water from the well, prayers in languages that predated the plantation by thousands of years. They formed a circle around Charlotte's mattress, their voices joining in a low humming that sounded like bees or distant thunder, or the ocean calling its children home. Charlotte drifted in and out of consciousness through that long night, her mind wandering between the world of flesh and pain and another place entirely, a place where spirits dwelled and justice was more than just a word white folks used to justify their cruelty. She could hear the women singing, feel their hands gentle on her fevered skin, taste the bitter herbs they spooned between her lips to keep the infection from claiming her life. But more than that, she could feel something else gathering around her broken body, the presence of every soul who had ever suffered at that whipping post, every spirit that had been tortured and broken, but never truly defeated. They was coming to her in her delirium, offering their strength, their rage, their unfinished business with the world of the living. Charlotte was becoming a vessel for all their accumulated pain and power. In her fever dreams, she walked with warriors who had fought slavers on African beaches, women who had led revolts on plantations across the South, children who had chosen death over submission. They showed her things that hadn't happened yet, but would come to pass: uprisings and escapes, masters brought low by their own cruelty, a reckoning that was building like storm clouds on the horizon. "Your time ain't finished yet, child," whispered a voice that might have been her own grandmother, or might have been the first woman ever stolen from Africa's shores. "The salt they put in your wound's gonna birth something they never intended. Pain this deep don't just disappear. It transforms into power, into purpose, into the kind of justice that shakes the foundations of the world." Through the long hours of that terrible night, Charlotte's body fought for life, while her spirit traveled roads that maps couldn't show. She saw the plantation from above, like she was flying with the night birds, and she could see all the suffering contained within its boundaries. Children sold away from their mothers, women used and discarded, men worked to death in fields that would never be theirs. But she also saw the seeds of resistance growing in the darkness: Moses and his connections to the Underground Railroad, the secret meetings in the praise house where freedom was planned in coded spirituals, the anger building in hearts that had been pushed too far. Charlotte's defiance at the whipping post wasn't an ending, it was a beginning, the first crack in a dam that would eventually burst and sweep the whole rotten system away. As dawn approached, Charlotte's fever broke like a summer storm passing, leaving her weak but clear-minded, her back still on fire, but her spirit somehow stronger than before. The women had worked through the night, applying poultices and chanting prayers and calling on every power they knew to keep her breathing. Old Aunt Celia sat beside her still, her ancient hands steady as she spooned bitter tea between Charlotte's cracked lips. "How you feeling, child?" Celia asked, her voice soft as morning mist. Charlotte tried to speak and found her throat raw as sandpaper, but when words finally came, they carried a weight that made the old conjure woman lean back in surprise. "I feel like fire," Charlotte whispered. "I feel like justice waiting to be born." Outside, the plantation was stirring to life, masters and overseers and drivers preparing for another day of organized cruelty. But inside that small cabin, something had changed during the night, something that would reshape the destiny of every soul on that cursed land. Charlotte had survived the salt, and in surviving, she had become something new, something the plantation system had no defenses against. The reckoning was coming, sure as sunrise, sure as justice delayed but not denied. Days passed like the slow turning of a mill wheel, each one grinding Charlotte's body toward healing, while her mind sharpened itself on the whetstone of remembered pain. She lay on that corn shuck mattress, her back crusted with scabs that pulled tight every time she moved, the salt burns leaving patterns on her skin like ritual scarification. But Lord have mercy, that woman's eyes burned brighter than ever, like coals that had been banked but not extinguished. The other slaves brought her food when they could spare it. Cold cornbread saved from their own meager portions. Thin soup made from potato peelings and whatever greens they could find growing wild around the quarters. They whispered news of the plantation while she healed, telling her how Master Whitmore had been different since the whipping, nervous and quick to anger, like a man who had stirred up something he couldn't control. "He been asking about you," said Sarah, a young woman who worked in the big house laundry, "wanting to know if you was healing proper, if you was talking about what happened. He got that look in his eyes like he's worried about something." Charlotte listened but said little, conserving her strength for what she somehow knew was coming. The ancestors had shown her glimpses during her fever dreams, fragments of a future that felt as certain as sunrise. She would have her moment with Master Whitmore again, not tied to a post this time, but free and facing him as an equal. The salt he had rubbed into her wounds would be the salt that seasoned his own bitter medicine. Old Aunt Celia came every evening, checking Charlotte's wounds and bringing herbs to keep infection away. The conjure woman had seen something in Charlotte during those first terrible hours after the whipping, something that made her treat the healing with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred rituals. She would trace symbols in the air above Charlotte's back, muttering words in languages that predated slavery, calling on powers older than Christian prayers. "You changing, child," Celia said one evening as she applied a poultice of moss and honey to Charlotte's scars. "I can see it in your eyes, feel it in the air around you. Whatever they awakened in you with that salt, it ain't something they can put back to sleep." Charlotte turned her head to look at the old woman, her voice still weak but carrying new authority. "What do you see, Aunt Celia? What's growing in me?" The conjure woman's hands stilled for a moment, her cloudy eyes focusing on something beyond the physical world. "I see justice, child. I see the kind of reckoning that turns the world upside down. But I also see danger, not just for you, but for all of us. Power like what's building in you. It draws attention from things that don't want to see the natural order disturbed." Outside the cabin, night was falling over the plantation like a shroud, bringing with it the sounds that marked the end of another day of organized suffering. The last bell from the big house calling the servants to their final tasks. The distant sound of chains being secured in the slave quarters. The mournful singing that rose from the praise house where souls gathered to find what comfort they could in each other, and in promises of a better world to come. Charlotte listened to those night sounds with new ears, hearing in them not just resignation but the building rhythm of resistance. She could feel it growing all across the plantation. In Moses down by the stables, who was making quiet contact with conductors on the Underground Railroad. In the field hands who had seen her defiance and felt their own spirits stirring. In the house servants who were learning to move through the big house like ghosts, invisible but always watching, always listening. The salt burns on her back were healing into thick raised scars that would mark her for life. But Charlotte had come to see them not as disfigurement, but as badges of honor. Proof that she had faced the worst the plantation system could offer, and emerged unbroken. Each scar told the story of her refusal to bow, her determination to remain human in a world designed to make her into livestock. As the weeks passed and Charlotte grew stronger, word began to spread beyond the plantation boundaries. Other slaves brought in to help with harvest time or to deliver supplies carried the story of the woman who had looked Master Whitmore in the eye and survived the salt treatment without breaking. The tale grew in the telling, as stories will, until Charlotte became a kind of legend among the enslaved people of the county. But legends, as old Aunt Celia knew, could be dangerous things. They inspired hope, which was beautiful, but they also drew attention from those who made their living by crushing hope wherever it sprouted. Master Whitmore was getting questions from other plantation owners, pointed inquiries about whether he was maintaining proper discipline among his property. The pressure was building for him to prove that Charlotte's spirit had been properly broken. One evening, as autumn painted the cotton fields gold and red, Charlotte finally felt strong enough to walk outside her cabin for the first time since the whipping. Her back still pulled with every step, the scars tight as drumheads. But she needed to feel dirt under her bare feet, needed to breathe air that hadn't been trapped between wooden walls. She walked slowly toward the whipping post that had marked her transformation from slave to something else entirely. The post stood empty in the gathering darkness, its blood-stained wood seeming to absorb what little light remained in the sky. Charlotte reached out and placed her palm against its rough surface, feeling the pain of every soul who had suffered there before her. But she also felt something else: their strength, their refusal to be forgotten, their demand for justice that echoed through time like thunder that never quite faded away. As she stood there in the dying light, Charlotte made a silent promise to all the spirits she could feel gathering around her. The salt that had been meant to break her spirit would instead season the dish of justice she was preparing to serve. Master Whitmore thought he had taught her a lesson about knowing her place, but the only lesson Charlotte had learned was that her place was wherever she chose to stand. The reckoning was coming, sure as winter followed autumn, and when it arrived, Master Whitmore would discover what the ancestors had always known: that some fires, once lit, could never be extinguished. Lord, have mercy on my soul. What I'm about to tell you next might make you think the devil himself had come walking through those plantation gates. But children, sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, and what looks like evil might just be justice wearing a different face. Master Whitmore had been feeling poorly for weeks after Charlotte's whipping, like something inside him was eating away at his very essence, gnawing at him from the inside out like a cancer with teeth. It started small, the way these things always do. A little trembling in his hands when he reached for his morning coffee, served on fine china by house servants who moved like shadows through rooms that reeked of guilt and old sin. His appetite began to fail, and the rich foods that used to bring him such pleasure turned to ash in his mouth. The bourbon that had always soothed his nerves started tasting like bitter medicine, and his sleep became troubled by dreams he couldn't quite remember. But that left him shaking and covered in cold sweat. Master Whitmore told himself it was just the change of seasons, maybe something he'd eaten that didn't agree with him, but deep in his heart he knew better. Ever since he'd ordered that salt rubbed into Charlotte's wounds, something had shifted in the spiritual atmosphere of the plantation. The house servants whispered about it when they thought he couldn't hear, how the very air seemed heavier, how shadows lingered longer than they should, how sometimes you could hear voices in the wind that spoke in languages older than memory. Old Aunt Celia knew what was happening, of course. She'd seen it before, back when she was young and still practicing the full power of her conjure work. When you inflict that kind of deliberate cruelty on someone who carries ancestral fire in their blood, when you add salt to wounds that connect to generations of suffering, you don't just hurt one person. You wake up sleeping spirits. You call down attention from powers that don't take kindly to such deliberate evil. The other plantation owners had been putting pressure on Whitmore, questioning whether he was maintaining proper control over his property. They'd heard about Charlotte's defiance, about how she'd looked him in the eye and refused to break even under the salt treatment. Some were saying he'd gone too easy on her, that he should have made an example that would be remembered for generations. Others whispered that he'd created a dangerous precedent. That word was spreading among the slave population about a woman who couldn't be broken. But what they didn't understand, what none of them white folks could grasp, was that Charlotte hadn't just survived their worst punishment. She'd transformed it into something else entirely. Every grain of salt that had burned into her flesh had become a prayer for justice. Every moment of agony had fed the fire of righteous anger that now burned in her spirit like a forge, where weapons of retribution were being hammered into shape. Master Whitmore's condition worsened as autumn deepened into winter. His hands developed a tremor that made it hard for him to hold a pen steady when he wrote in his plantation ledgers, recording the buying and selling of human souls like they were livestock. His face grew gaunt, the flesh seeming to shrink back from his bones, as if his very body was rejecting the evil that had taken up residence in his soul. He began to see things in the corners of his vision, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, faces that appeared in mirrors and windows only to vanish when he turned to look directly at them. The household servants noticed that he'd taken to drinking more heavily, starting earlier in the day and continuing long into the night. They found him sometimes in his study, passed out over his desk with empty bottles scattered around him like fallen soldiers after a lost battle. But even drunk, even unconscious, he found no peace. The dreams that came to him were filled with visions of Charlotte standing over him, her scarred back gleaming in moonlight, her eyes burning with the accumulated rage of every soul who had ever suffered under his whip. Christmas came and went without celebration on the Whitmore plantation. Usually the master made a show of giving his slaves an extra day of rest and a little extra food, playing the role of benevolent patriarch that helped him sleep better at night. But this year, he seemed to have forgotten that such niceties existed. He remained locked in his study most days, emerging only to bark orders at his overseers with a voice that had grown thin and reedy, like wind whistling through the gaps in a rotting fence. Burns, the overseer, was getting nervous about his master's condition. The man who had once been so quick to order punishments, so eager to demonstrate his authority over every soul on the plantation, had become erratic and unpredictable. Sometimes he would fly into rages over minor infractions, demanding harsh punishments for slaves who had done nothing worse than move too slowly or speak too loudly. Other times he would stare right through clear violations of plantation rules, as if he couldn't see them at all. The slaves in the quarters knew something was shifting, could feel it in the very air they breathed. Charlotte had been seen walking the grounds at night, her healing back straight and proud, her presence seeming to draw strength from the darkness itself. She would stop at the whipping post sometimes, placing her hand on its blood-stained surface, as if she was receiving messages from all the spirits who had suffered there before her. Old Moses down by the stables whispered that the Underground Railroad was more active than it had ever been, with conductors coming through almost weekly to guide freedom seekers north to safety. But something told him that Charlotte wouldn't be among those who ran. She had unfinished business here, a debt that needed to be collected before she could think about her own escape. Justice had its own timeline, and Charlotte had learned to be patient, to wait for the moment when the scales would balance themselves. By the time January winds started blowing across the cotton fields, carrying with them the promise of another planting season, Master Whitmore had taken to his bed with what the local doctor diagnosed as a fever of unknown origin. But old Aunt Celia knew better. She'd seen this sickness before, had watched it consume men who thought their cruelty would go unpunished forever. It was the fever of guilt made manifest, of spiritual poison working its way through a system that had been corrupted beyond redemption. And in her cabin in the quarters, Charlotte waited with the patience of someone who knew that justice, like the seasons, followed its own natural rhythm. The salt that had been meant to break her spirit was about to season a dish of retribution that Master Whitmore would find impossible to swallow. The fever took hold of Master Whitmore like a demon claiming its due, settling into his bones with the kind of persistence that spoke of supernatural origins. Dr. Morrison came and went, prescribing bloodletting and bitter tonics, but his medicines seemed to make the condition worse rather than better. The master's temperature would spike and fall unpredictably, leaving him delirious one moment and shivering with bone-deep cold the next. It was during one of these fevered spells that something extraordinary happened, something that would be whispered about in slave quarters across 3 counties for years to come. Master Whitmore began to speak in voices that weren't his own, crying out in languages that sounded like they came from across the ocean, from shores where slave ships had once loaded their human cargo. He would thrash in his bed, his pale hands clutching at invisible chains, his voice rising in anguished wails that made even the hardest overseers cross themselves and step back from his door. Miss Margaret, his wife, had taken to her room with her laudanum and her prayer book, unable to bear the sight of her husband's deterioration. She'd always been a delicate woman, raised on stories of Southern gentility that painted slavery as a benevolent institution where grateful servants lived in harmony with their wise masters. The reality of what her comfortable life was built on had always been carefully hidden from her view. But now it was seeping through the walls of the big house like blood through bandages. The house servants moved through their duties like ghosts, speaking in whispers and jumping at every shadow. They'd always known that their master was capable of great cruelty, but seeing him reduced to this writhing, babbling shell of a man filled them with a mixture of fear and something that might have been satisfaction. Divine justice, some of them whispered when they thought no one was listening. The Lord was finally calling in his debts, but it was old Aunt Celia who understood what was really happening. She'd seen the signs building for weeks, the way birds avoided flying over the big house, how horses shied away from Master Whitmore when he tried to mount them, the way milk soured faster than it should, and flowers wilted in his presence. The man had called down something on himself when he ordered that salt rubbed into Charlotte's wounds, had opened a door between worlds that he didn't know how to close. He'd unmeddled with forces beyond his understanding, Celia told the other women in the quarters one evening, as they gathered around her cabin. That salt he used on Charlotte, it carried the tears of every mother who ever lost a child to slavery, the blood of every man who ever died under the lash. You can't use such things for evil without calling down the attention of powers that don't forgive and don't forget. The news of Master Whitmore's condition spread beyond the plantation boundaries like wildfire through dry grass. Other slave owners came to visit, ostensibly to pay their respects to a fellow planter in distress, but really to see for themselves if the stories they'd been hearing were true. They found a man who barely resembled the confident master they'd known, a hollow-eyed wraith who flinched at loud noises and seemed to see threatening figures in every shadow. Dr. Morrison was baffled by his patient's condition and growing increasingly desperate in his treatments. He'd tried everything in his medical arsenal, purges and bloodletting, cold baths and hot compresses, laudanum and quinine, but nothing seemed to touch whatever was consuming Master Whitmore from the inside out. The doctor had begun to mutter about consulting with specialists in Charleston, or even sending to Baltimore for physicians who specialized in disorders of the mind. It was during this crisis that Burns the overseer made a decision that would change everything. Faced with a master who could no longer function and a plantation that was sliding toward chaos, he decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. The house servants had been whispering about old Aunt Celia's reputation as a healer, about the remedies she'd used to treat everything from consumption to broken bones. If white medicine couldn't help Master Whitmore, maybe it was time to try something older. Something that had been healing bodies and spirits long before the first European ship landed on African shores. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who understood the situation. The same master who had forbidden his slaves from practicing their ancestral healing arts, who had threatened brutal punishment for anyone caught with conjure bags or healing herbs, was now so desperate that his overseer was considering calling on those very powers for salvation. But desperation, as the old folks always said, could make even the proudest man humble. Charlotte heard about the overseer's plan through the network of whispers that connected every cabin in the quarters. She was sitting outside her door in the afternoon sun, her scarred back warm against the rough wooden wall, when Sarah from the big house came hurrying down the path with news that made Charlotte's blood run cold and hot at the same time. "They fixing to ask Aunt Celia to tend to Master Whitmore," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible even in the privacy of the quarters. "Burns sent word that he wants to see what she can do with her roots and herbs." Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for generations. The ancestors had shown her glimpses of this moment during her healing dreams, but experiencing it in waking reality was different, more powerful, more terrifying in its implications. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the opportunity that justice had been preparing for her since the first grain of salt had touched her wounds. "And what did Aunt Celia say?" Charlotte asked, though she already knew the answer. She said she'd consider it, but only if she could choose her own assistant to help with the healing work. Sarah's eyes met Charlotte's, and in that look passed an understanding that needed no words. She said she'd need someone with strong hands and a knowledge of suffering to help prepare the medicines. Charlotte nodded slowly, feeling the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a mantle passed down from the ancestors. The salt that had been meant to break her spirit was about to become the seasoning for a feast of justice that would satisfy the hunger of every soul who had ever suffered under Master Whitmore's cruel hand. The circle was closing, and Charlotte would be the one to complete it. In the big house, Master Whitmore thrashed in his fever dreams, unaware that his salvation, or his damnation, was about to walk through his door carrying a bowl of water and wearing the scars he had carved into her flesh with his own hands. The summons came at twilight, when the sky was bleeding red over the cotton fields, and the first stars were beginning to pierce the gathering darkness. Burns stood at the door of Aunt Celia's cabin, his hat in his hands and his face drawn with worry, looking more like a man begging for mercy than an overseer giving orders. The proud, cruel driver who had administered so many beatings was reduced to asking for help from the very people he'd spent his life tormenting. "Aunt Celia," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "Master Whitmore he's in a bad way. Real bad. Doctor Morrison says he don't know what else to try. We was hoping, that is, if you've got anything that might help." The old conjure woman looked at him for a long moment, her cloudy eyes seeming to see right through his flesh, to the black stain on his soul beneath. She'd known this moment was coming, had seen it in the patterns of smoke rising from her cooking fire, in the way shadows fell across her doorway, in the dreams that visited her in the hours before dawn, when the veil between worlds grew thin. "I might have something," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom and carefully controlled power. "But healing work like this, it ain't something you do alone. I'll need an assistant, someone with strong hands and a pure heart to help prepare the medicines." Burns nodded eagerly, willing to agree to anything that might save his master and, by extension, his own position on the plantation. "Whatever you need, Aunt Celia, just tell me who you want." "Charlotte," Celia said simply, and the name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of implication spreading outward into the gathering night. Burns stiffened, his face going pale in the lamplight. Of all the slaves he might have expected her to choose, Charlotte was the last one he would have suggested. The woman who had defied Master Whitmore, who had looked him in the eye and refused to break under the salt treatment, who had become a symbol of resistance throughout the quarters. Sending her into the big house to tend to her former tormentor seemed like inviting disaster. "Charlotte?" he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Are you sure that's wise, given what happened between her and the master?" Old Aunt Celia's eyes flashed with something that made Burns take a step backward. "You asking me to heal your master or not? 'Cause if you are, then you don't get to choose my methods. Charlotte's got healing in her hands and she knows suffering better than most. That's what this work requires, someone who understands pain and what it can teach." The truth was more complex than Celia let on, though she wasn't about to explain it to an overseer, whose understanding of spiritual matters went no deeper than Sunday sermons about obedience and submission. Charlotte wasn't being chosen for her healing abilities, though she did possess those. She was being chosen because the ancestors demanded it, because justice had its own requirements that transcended the simple categories of healing and harm. Burns stood there in the doorway, caught between his desperation to save his master and his fear of what might happen if Charlotte was allowed into the big house while Whitmore lay helpless in his bed. But desperation won out, as Celia had known it would. When a man is drowning, he'll grab onto any rope thrown to him, even if it's held by someone he's wronged. "All right," he said finally, "but I'll need to be present during the treatment to make sure everything stays proper." Celia nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable, though she was already planning how to ensure that when the crucial moment came, Burns would be nowhere near the master's bedroom. The overseer might think he was in control of the situation, but he was just another piece being moved around a board where the game had been set up long before he was born. Within the hour, Charlotte found herself walking up the path to the big house, carrying a basket filled with herbs and roots and bottles of liquid that caught the moonlight strange. She moved with the measured pace of someone performing a ritual, each step deliberate and weighted with purpose. The scars on her back pulled tight under her clean dress, The same dress she'd been wearing the day she was whipped, now mended and washed, but carrying the memory of that pain like a blessing. The big house loomed ahead of her in the darkness, its white columns glowing ghostly in the starlight. Charlotte had been inside before, but always as a servant, always invisible, always moving through those marble halls like a shadow among shadows. Tonight was different. Tonight she was walking into that house as an equal, carrying power that the masters had no name for, no way to control or contain. Inside, the house smelled of sickness and fear, expensive perfumes trying to mask the stench of a man's body betraying him, fine furniture gathering dust while its owner thrashed in fevered delirium. Charlotte followed Aunt Celia up the grand staircase, her bare feet silent on carpet that cost more than most slaves would see in a lifetime, past portraits of dead Whitmores who stared down from gilt frames with the same cold eyes that had watched her suffer. Master Whitmore's bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, and even before they reached the door, Charlotte could hear him moaning and muttering in his fever. The sound sent chills down her spine, but not from fear, from anticipation. The moment she had been preparing for, consciously and unconsciously, ever since the first grain of salt touched her wounds, was finally at hand. Aunt Celia paused at the bedroom door, her hand on the brass handle, and turned to look at Charlotte with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of their ancestors. "You ready for this, child?" she asked softly. "Once we walk through this door, there ain't no going back. What happens next gonna change everything, for you and for this whole plantation." Charlotte met her gaze steadily, feeling the weight of every scar on her back, every grain of salt that had burned into her flesh, every prayer for justice that had been whispered in the quarters through long, dark nights of suffering. "I've been ready my whole life," she said, and her voice carried the power of truth spoken by someone who had walked through fire and emerged transformed. "Let's go give Master Whitmore the healing he deserves." The bedroom door opened with a soft whisper, like the sound of wings brushing against silk, and Charlotte stepped across the threshold into a world she had only glimpsed from the shadows. Master Whitmore's chamber was a monument to wealth built on the backs of stolen souls. Mahogany furniture carved by craftsmen who would never see freedom. Silk curtains dyed with colors extracted from distant lands by enslaved hands. Crystal chandeliers that caught and scattered light like frozen tears. But all that finery meant nothing now, because at the center of it all lay a man reduced to his most basic elements of flesh and fear. Master Whitmore thrashed in his four-poster bed, the fine linen sheets soaked with sweat that carried the stench of spiritual sickness. His pale skin stretched tight over bones that seemed to be shrinking away from the evil that had taken root in his soul. His eyes rolled wild in his head, sometimes focusing on nothing, sometimes staring at corners of the room where shadows moved in ways that defied natural law. Charlotte moved into the room like she was entering a sacred space, her feet silent on Persian rugs that had absorbed decades of tears and pleadings from house servants who had suffered behind these closed doors. She could feel the weight of history in this room, the accumulated pain of every soul who had been broken within these walls. Young girls called up from the quarters to satisfy their masters' darker appetites. Grown men beaten for infractions as small as a sideways glance. Children sold away from their mothers to pay for the luxuries that surrounded her now. Aunt Celia followed behind, her ancient hands steady as she began unpacking the contents of her healing basket onto a marble-topped table that reflected their movements like a dark mirror. Each item she withdrew seemed to carry its own power. Roots twisted into shapes that resembled human limbs, bottles filled with liquids that swirled with their own inner light, pouches of herbs that released scents older than memory when opened. Burns, the overseer, stood near the window, his nervous energy filling the room like smoke from a poorly tended fire. He kept glancing between Charlotte and his delirious master, clearly regretting his decision to allow this woman into the house, but trapped by his own desperation. Dr. Morrison sat in a chair beside the bed, his medical bag open but useless, his face showing the defeat of a man whose science had proven inadequate against forces beyond his comprehension. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Burns asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "The master's been calling out in strange tongues. seeing things that ain't there. This don't look like any sickness I ever seen before. Old Aunt Celia glanced up from her preparations, her cloudy eyes fixing on the overseer with the kind of look that made brave men remember their mortality. "Some sicknesses got roots deeper than the body," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked between worlds for longer than most people had been alive. "This man's been feeding on pain and cruelty for so long, it's finally started eating him from the inside out. You want him healed, you got to draw out the poison that's been building up in his spirit for decades." Charlotte began preparing a basin of water, her movements deliberate and ritualistic, each gesture carrying meaning that went far beyond the simple task at hand. The water came from a natural spring that bubbled up from deep earth, never touched by sunlight, carrying within it the memory of rain that fell before the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic. To this she added a handful of salt, not the coarse crystals that had been rubbed into her wounds, but fine white grains that had been blessed under a new moon and charged with intentions of justice rather than cruelty. As she worked, Charlotte could feel the presence of every ancestor who had suffered in this house, their spirits gathering like a silent congregation around the bed where their former tormentor lay writhing in the grip of his own accumulated sins. She could hear their voices whispering in languages that slavery had tried to silence, offering guidance and strength for what she was about to do. This wasn't just healing work. This was the settling of accounts that had been accumulating interest for generations. Master Whitmore's fever seemed to intensify as Charlotte approached his bedside, his body responding to her presence with the kind of recognition that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the soul. He began muttering more frantically, his words a mixture of English and sounds that seemed to come from deeper places, darker places, places where guilt lived and fed on itself like some cannibalistic spirit. "Hold him steady," Aunt Celia instructed, though whether she was speaking to Burns or to forces unseen was unclear. "This next part requires precision. One wrong move and we could lose him entirely, or worse, we could set free something that's better left contained." Charlotte placed her hands on Master Whitmore's fevered skin, and the reaction was immediate and electric. His eyes snapped open, focusing on her face with the kind of clarity that had been absent for days. In that moment of recognition, she saw everything: the fear, the guilt, the dawning understanding that justice had finally come calling in a form he never could have anticipated. "You?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming but carrying all the shock of a man who suddenly realizes the full weight of his sins. "You're supposed to be broken. I broke you. I salted your wounds. I made you scream." Charlotte looked down at him with eyes that held no hatred, no desire for simple revenge, but something far more powerful: the calm certainty of someone who had been chosen by forces larger than herself to balance scales that had been tipped toward cruelty for far too long. "Yes," she said simply, "you did all of that, and now I'm here to return the favor." From her basin, she lifted a cloth soaked in the blessed salt water, the liquid dripping between her fingers like tears shed for every soul who had suffered in this house. Master Whitmore's eyes went wide with understanding and terror as he realized what was about to happen, his body trying to shrink away from her touch even though the fever had left him too weak to move. "Please," he whispered, and the word carried all the desperation that Charlotte had never been allowed to voice during her own ordeal. "Please, I'm sick. I need healing, not more punishment." Charlotte paused, the cloth dripping salt water onto silk sheets that had been woven by enslaved hands in distant mills. For a moment, the room held its breath, waiting to see if mercy might triumph over justice, if forgiveness might prove stronger than the accumulated rage of generations. "You told me that salt heals," Charlotte said, her voice steady as stone, carrying no anger but an implacability that was somehow more terrifying than rage. "You told me this while you rubbed it into wounds you had carved into my flesh with your own hands. So I'm going to heal you the same way you healed me." The cloth touched his skin, and Master Whitmore's scream echoed through the house like the cry of a soul being dragged down to judgment. But it wasn't just his voice that filled the air. It was the voices of every person he had ever tortured, every child he had sold, every woman he had violated, every man he had worked to death in fields that would never belong to them. The salt water found every cut, every scrape, every place where guilt had worn his spiritual defenses thin. It burned with the fire of accumulated justice, each drop carrying the tears of mothers separated from their children, the blood of fathers beaten to death for trying to protect their families, the sweat of countless souls who had died under the lash while he watched from the shade of his veranda. Burns started forward, his hand reaching for his pistol, but Aunt Celia caught his wrist with fingers that felt like iron wrapped in ancient leather. "You asked for healing," she said, her voice cutting through Whitmore's screams like a knife through silk. "This is what healing looks like when the poison's gone this deep. You interfere now, and you'll kill him sure as shooting." Charlotte worked methodically, covering every inch of exposed skin with the salt-blessed water, watching as Master Whitmore experienced in concentrated form all the agony he had inflicted over years of calculated cruelty. His back arched off the bed, his hands clawed at the air. His voice rose and fell in waves of anguish that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. But slowly, gradually, something began to change. The fever broke like a summer storm passing, leaving him weak but clear-eyed, his breathing steady for the first time in weeks. The spiritual poison that had been eating him alive was being drawn out by the same element he had used to cause suffering. Salt transformed from an instrument of torture into a tool of purification. As the treatment continued, Charlotte felt something shifting inside herself as well. The anger that had sustained her through months of healing was being transmuted into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace that came from knowing that justice had finally been served. The ancestors who had gathered around the bed began to withdraw, their voices fading to whispers of approval and gratitude. When it was finished, when the last of the salt water had been applied and Master Whitmore lay still and quiet on his sweat-soaked sheets, Charlotte stepped back and looked down at the man who had once held the power of life and death over her. He was still alive, still breathing, but something fundamental had changed in him. The arrogance was gone. The casual cruelty that had marked his every interaction with his slaves had been burned away by his own medicine. "How do you feel now, Master?" Charlotte asked, and her voice carried no mockery, no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a job completed according to the will of forces larger than any individual desire for revenge. Master Whitmore looked up at her with eyes that held a new understanding of what it meant to be powerless, to be at the mercy of another's whims, to suffer without hope of relief. When he spoke, his voice was different, smaller, humbler, marked by the kind of knowledge that only comes from walking through fire and emerging on the other side. "I feel," he said slowly, each word carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "like I finally understand what I've been doing to people for all these years." Charlotte nodded, then turned to gather up the basin and cloths, her work in this room complete. Behind her, Master Whitmore continued to stare at the ceiling, processing the revelation that had come to him through pain, the same revelation that Charlotte had carried in her heart since childhood, the knowledge that every human soul was worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Justice, Charlotte realized as she prepared to leave, was not about revenge. It was about balance, about teaching those who had forgotten their humanity how to remember it again. And sometimes, the only teacher powerful enough for such a lesson was pain itself, the same pain they had so casually inflicted on others. The change in Master Whitmore was like watching a man wake up from a lifetime of sleepwalking, stumbling around in a world he suddenly saw with new eyes. In the days that followed Charlotte's treatment, he moved through his house like a stranger visiting someone else's life, picking up objects that had once brought him pride and setting them down again, as if they had become too heavy to hold. The morning after his fever broke, he called for Burns to bring him his ledger books, those careful records where he had cataloged every soul he owned like entries in a merchant's inventory. For hours, he sat at his mahogany desk, reading through page after page of names and ages and prices paid, seeing for the first time not just numbers and property values, but human beings whose lives he had bought and sold without a second thought. Sarah, 15 years old, good for housework or breeding. Purchased for $300. He read aloud, his voice hoarse with something that might have been shame. Jacob, 32, strong back, lost 2 fingers to cotton gin, marked down to $250. Each entry was a life reduced to its economic value, a soul transformed into commodity. And Master Whitmore found himself remembering faces to go with the names, remembering the fear in their eyes when they were brought to the auction block. The house servants noticed the change immediately. Instead of barking orders without looking at them, Master Whitmore began to actually see the people who moved through his house like shadows. He started saying, "Please" and "Thank you," words that had never passed his lips when speaking to slaves. And his voice carried a tone of respect that left them confused and wary. After years of invisibility, being suddenly acknowledged as human beings was more unsettling than comforting. Miss Margaret, his wife, was perhaps the most disturbed by her husband's transformation. She had built her entire identity around being the gracious mistress of a grand plantation, dispensing small kindnesses to grateful slaves, while remaining blissfully ignorant of the brutality that funded her comfortable existence. Now her husband was talking about the moral weight of ownership and questioning whether they had the right to hold other human beings in bondage. "James, you're talking like an abolitionist," she said one evening over dinner, her voice shrill with anxiety. "What's gotten into you? Dr. Morrison said your fever might have affected your mind, but I never thought... Have you forgotten that our entire way of life depends on maintaining proper order?" But Master Whitmore, James, as he had begun insisting the house servants call him, was remembering things that his fever dreams had shown him. Visions of the suffering he had caused and the spiritual debt he had accumulated through years of casual cruelty. The salt treatment had not just healed his body. It had opened his eyes to truths he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. Down in the quarters, the slaves watched these changes with a mixture of hope and suspicion. They had seen masters go through periods of guilt before, usually after a particularly brutal punishment or when confronted by visiting abolitionists. But such phases rarely lasted long. The economic pressures of plantation life, the social expectations of their neighbors, and their own ingrained beliefs about racial hierarchy usually pulled them back to their old ways soon enough. But Charlotte knew this was different. She could see it in the way James Whitmore carried himself now, the weight of genuine remorse bending his shoulders like a physical burden. The salt treatment had done more than teach him empathy through pain. It had connected him to the spiritual reality of his actions, forcing him to feel the accumulated anguish of everyone he had wronged. Old Aunt Celia watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone whose work had achieved exactly the results she intended. The healing had not been about curing a fever. It had been about curing a soul that had become diseased through years of treating other human beings as property. The salt had drawn out spiritual poison the same way it might draw infection from a physical wound. 2 weeks after his recovery, James Whitmore called a meeting of all his slaves in the yard where Charlotte had been whipped. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The same space where he had once demonstrated his absolute power through cruelty was now the stage for something unprecedented in the history of the plantation. He stood before them, without the usual props of authority. No whip, no overseer flanking him, no mounted position that elevated him above the people he addressed. Instead, he faced them as equals, his voice carrying none of the commanding tone that had once made grown men tremble. "I want to speak to you about what's been happening on this plantation," he began, his words careful and measured. "About things I've done, orders I've given, pain I've caused. I want to talk about the whipping post that stood in this yard for 20 years, and about the salt I've had rubbed into wounds I ordered opened." The gathered slaves shifted uneasily, uncertain where this unprecedented speech was leading. Some remembered similar gatherings that had ended with brutal examples being made of anyone who dared to hope that change might be possible. But Charlotte stood steady among them, her scarred back straight and her eyes meeting her former master's gaze without fear. "I used to tell myself that salt heals," Whitmore continued, his voice growing stronger. "I used it on your wounds and called it medicine, called it necessary for your own good. But I learned something in my sickness. Salt only heals when it's used with compassion, with genuine intent to cure rather than cause suffering. When it's used in anger, in cruelty, in the desire to break someone's spirit, it becomes poison. He paused, looking around the circle of faces that watched him with expressions ranging from suspicion to amazement. Charlotte showed me what salt really meant when she used it to treat my fever. She could have killed me. God knows I gave her reason enough. But instead, she healed me by helping me understand the pain I had caused. She taught me that justice isn't about revenge. It's about balance, about making things right. Burns, the overseer, stood at the edge of the gathering, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. This wasn't how the natural order was supposed to work. Masters didn't apologize to slaves, didn't acknowledge their humanity, didn't speak of justice as if it applied equally to black and white. He could see his position on the plantation, indeed the entire plantation system as he understood it, crumbling before his eyes. "What are you saying, Mr. Whitmore?" Burns interrupted, his voice sharp with barely controlled panic. "Are you saying we should just let them run wild? There's got to be discipline, got to be order. You start treating them like equals and you'll have rebellion on your hands inside a week." James Whitmore turned to face his overseer, and in his eyes was a calm certainty that made Burns step back involuntarily. "I'm saying that the only rebellion I need to worry about is the one I've been carrying in my own heart, the rebellion against treating other human beings with dignity and respect. That ends today." He reached into his coat and pulled out a sheet of paper, legal documents that he had spent the morning preparing with a lawyer from town, papers that would change the lives of every person standing in that yard. "I'm freeing you," he said simply. "All of you. Not gradually, not conditionally, but immediately and completely. You're no longer slaves. You're free men and women. And this plantation is no longer a prison, but a place where you can choose to stay and work for wages, or leave and build new lives wherever you see fit." The silence that followed was so complete that even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. No one moved, no one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe as the magnitude of what they had just heard slowly sank in. Freedom, the word that had lived in their prayers and dreams and whispered conversations, was being offered to them by the very man who had held them in bondage. Charlotte felt tears running down her cheeks, but they were not tears of joy alone. They carried the salt of every ancestor who had died in chains, every mother who had lost her children to the auction block, every father who had been worked to death in fields he would never own. This moment was theirs as much as it was hers. Their suffering finally acknowledged, their humanity finally recognized, their long wait for justice finally ended. But even as freedom was being offered, Charlotte knew that the real work was just beginning. Freedom was not just the absence of chains, it was the presence of opportunity, the chance to build lives of dignity and purpose on foundations stronger than fear. The plantation system that had sustained itself on cruelty and dehumanization would not disappear overnight, and there would be those who would fight to maintain the old ways, even as the world changed around them. James Whitmore looked directly at Charlotte as he concluded his unprecedented speech. "I can't undo the pain I've caused," he said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "I can't bring back the time you've lost or erase the scars I've put on your bodies and souls. But I can promise that from this day forward, no whip will crack on this land, no salt will be used for cruelty, and no human being will be treated as property." Charlotte stepped forward from the crowd, her movement causing a ripple of attention that focused every eye in the yard on her scarred but unbowed figure. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had walked through fire and emerged transformed, someone who had faced the worst that humanity could offer and found within herself the strength to respond with justice rather than revenge. "Master, James," she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue but somehow right. "The scars you gave me will be with me till I die, but I don't carry them as shame anymore. I carry them as proof that some things can't be broken, no matter how hard you try. Freedom isn't something you can give us, it's something we carry inside us that no chains can touch. But I thank you for finally seeing what was always true. that we are human beings deserving of respect and dignity. She paused, looking around at the faces of her people, seeing in their eyes the dawning realization that the impossible had just become possible, that the prayers of generations had finally been answered in a way none of them could have imagined. "The salt you used on my wounds taught me something about pain and healing that I'll never forget," Charlotte continued. "Pain can break you if you let it, or it can make you stronger if you choose to let it teach you. Today, all of us are choosing to let our pain teach us how to be free. 5 years have passed since that day in the plantation yard when freedom was born from the ashes of cruelty, and I sit now on the porch of my own small cabin, watching the sun set over land that belongs to all of us who work it together. The old whipping post was the first thing we tore down after James Whitmore signed them freedom papers. And where it stood, we planted an oak tree that grows taller every year, its roots drinking from soil that once absorbed so much blood and tears. The world has changed in ways that none of us could have foreseen that day. The war came and went, leaving the whole South transformed, the plantation system that seemed so permanent crumbling like a house built on rotten foundations. Other masters weren't as willing as James Whitmore to see the humanity in their slaves, and they fought that change with every weapon they could muster. But change came anyway, carried on the wings of justice that had been building strength for generations. James Whitmore still lives in the big house, but it's different now, smaller somehow, more human in scale. He works alongside us in the fields during harvest time, his soft hands learning the calluses that come from honest labor. The guilt he carries has aged him beyond his years, but there's peace in his eyes that was never there before. The peace that comes from trying to make amends for a lifetime of wrong choices. Miss Margaret never could accept the new way of things. She left for Charleston within a month of the emancipation, taking her laudanum and her romantic notions about the Old South with her. Some folks say she lives with relatives who still talk about the plantation days like they was something to be proud of, but I don't waste much thought on her troubles. Everyone got to find their own way to live with what they've done and what's been done to them. Burns, the overseer, disappeared one night about a year after the freedom papers was signed, taking with him what valuables he could carry and leaving behind debts that took months to sort out. Word came back through the grapevine that he died in a barroom fight in New Orleans, still trying to make other folks pay for his own failures. I can't say I mourned his passing, but I didn't celebrate it either. Death comes for all of us eventually, and what matters is what we do with the time we're given. Old Aunt Celia lived to see 93 summers before the ancestors finally called her home. Right up to the end, she was still mixing herbs and delivering babies and settling disputes with the kind of wisdom that only comes from having seen everything this world can throw at a person. When she passed, we buried her with all the ceremony due a queen, because that's what she was. A queen of healing, a guardian of old knowledge, a bridge between the world of spirits and the world of flesh. Moses still tends the horses, but now he owns them instead of just caring for them. He married a woman from the next county over, a teacher who came down from Philadelphia to help establish schools for freed slaves. Their children learned to read and write in the same room where Moses used to sleep in hay. And sometimes when I hear them reciting their lessons, I think about all the knowledge that was kept from us for so long and feel grateful that those days are over. The Underground Railroad doesn't run through here anymore because it doesn't need to. Freedom isn't something you have to escape to find. It's something you carry with you wherever you go. But the safe house where runaway slaves used to hide has become a church where folks of all colors come to worship together, proving that some kinds of healing take time, but eventually take root. As for Charlotte, well, I reckon you can figure out who's been telling you this story all along. These old hands that once picked cotton now write letters for folks who never learned their letters. And sometimes, I write down stories like this one so that future generations will know what happened in the time before freedom, and how that freedom was won not through hatred, but through the kind of justice that transforms enemies into family. The scars on my back are still there, raised and thick as rope, but they don't ache like they used to. Sometimes children ask me about them, and I tell them the truth, that some marks on our bodies are reminders of pain we've survived, proof that we're stronger than anything this world can throw at us. I tell them that scars are just skin's way of remembering, and remembering is important work that we all got to do. I never married, though I had opportunities. Something about walking through that particular fire made me content with my own company, with the work of healing and teaching and helping other folks find their way to freedom. Love comes in many forms, and sometimes the deepest love is the kind you give to your community, your people, the ones who share your struggles and understand your journey without needing explanations. The plantation still grows cotton, but also vegetables and fruit trees, and we work the land together like a family instead of like master and property. James Whitmore set up a school in what used to be the overseer's house and hired teachers to come down from the north to help us learn reading and writing and arithmetic. Knowledge, we discovered, was like salt in the best sense. A little bit could transform a whole meal, and the more you used, the better everything tasted. Sometimes visitors come through, journalists and historians wanting to hear about the old days, about what it was like to live under slavery and how we survived it. I tell them what I've told you, that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about keeping your humanity intact, your dignity whole, your spirit free even when your body was bound. It was about learning that salt could be used for cruelty or for healing, depending on the heart and intentions of the one who applied it. The most important thing I learned, though, was that justice isn't about revenge. It isn't about making other folks suffer the way you suffered, or about turning the tables so that the oppressed become the oppressors. Real justice is about transformation, helping people understand the consequences of their actions, and giving them the chance to become something better than what they were. That don't mean you got to forgive everybody everything, or that you got to be friends with folks who wronged you. It means you got to find a way to live with what happened that doesn't poison your own soul with bitterness. The salt that was meant to break me became the salt that preserved my strength, that seasoned my wisdom, that helped me understand the difference between justice and revenge. When I die, and that day ain't too far off now, Lord willing, I want to be buried next to that oak tree we planted where the whipping post used to stand. I want my body to feed that tree's roots the same way the ancestors' suffering fed my strength. I want future generations to sit in its shade and remember that freedom isn't free. It's paid for with the courage of folks who refuse to let their spirits be broken, no matter how much salt was rubbed into their wounds. This story belongs to all of us who remember the time before, and all of us who inherited the consequences of what came after. It belongs to the children who will never know chains, but need to understand what their ancestors endured to purchase their freedom. It belongs to anyone who has ever suffered injustice and wondered whether fighting back was worth the cost. The answer I found, there in that moment when salt met wounds and pain became power, was that some things are worth any cost. Dignity, humanity, the right to look any other human being in the eye as an equal. These things can't be bought or sold or stolen. They can only be recognized or denied, honored or violated. I sit here on my porch in the evening light, watching my people's children play where we once suffered, and I know that the circle is complete. The salt has done its work, not just the salt that burned in my wounds, but the salt of tears shed for justice, the salt of sweat spent in honest labor, the salt of wisdom preserved through generations of struggle. Those who suffered, suffered. Those who resisted, left memory. And memory we keep here, in the scars of captivity. As long as these stories live in the voices of our people, as long as we remember both the pain and the power that came from it, the spirits of our ancestors rest easy, knowing their sacrifice was not in vain. The salt of our tears has seasoned the earth, and from that seasoned ground grows freedom. Not perfect, not complete, but real and growing stronger with each passing season. This is what we learned in the fire, that love is stronger than hate, that justice is deeper than revenge, and that the human spirit, properly tended, can survive anything and transform it into something beautiful. Remember this story, children of memory. Pass it on to your children and your children's children, because the day we stop telling these truths is the day we start forgetting who we are and how far we've come. And forgetting, as any old soul will tell you, is the one slavery that we choose for ourselves. The scars remain, but they no longer define us. We define them, as marks of survival, symbols of strength, proof that some things in this world are unbreakable no matter how much salt you pour into the wounds. We are the scars of captivity, and we endure.